So we're going to pick up where we left off last time with ecosystems, and be reminded that ecosystems are comprised of biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic factors are going to be those living organisms within an ecosystem, and they have or possess the characteristics of life, which means they have DNA, they have the ability to reproduce, and they produce offspring. Abiotic factors is going to be anything in the environment that is non-living, but they have a direct impact or influence on the survival of biotic factors or living things. So we're talking about precipitation, temperature, rocks, soil. So anything in the environment that actually has an influence on the ability for living things to survive. You see pictured the energy pyramid, or what we call the trophic level pyramid, and this depicts the relationship between producers and consumers. And you're going to find that producers are going to be found at the bottom of the pyramid, while you see various consumers pictured throughout the top. But you're going to find that consumers are going to be at the top of the pyramid, and that's going to be a tertiary consumer. You're going to find that most energy in a trophic level pyramid is going to be found at the bottom with producers, while the least amount of energy is going to be found at the top of the pyramid with the tertiary consumer. One of the consumers that's not mentioned here or seen in the pyramid is the quaternary consumer, and we'll talk a little bit about what that is in a few moments. But let's go back to producers. Producers are those organisms within an ecosystem that makes its own energy. It makes its own food. It takes energy from the sun and converts it into ATP, and we call that process photosynthesis. Producers are going to be those organisms also that we also refer to as autotrophs, and these are organisms that can make their own food, like plants and trees and bushes and those things that we consider plant life. And then you're going to also find in an ecosystem consumers that we call heterotrophs, and they get their energy from other sources. And so they actually either get it from a plant life or they get it from another consumer. You see here pictured a food chain, and this is a direct relationship between producers and a quaternary consumer. A quaternary consumer is going to be that organism within a food chain or food web that controls the population. And if anything were to happen to that specific organism, then the entire food chain or food web could collapse. You see that energy is being passed in the food chain from the producer to the primary consumer to the secondary consumer to the tertiary consumer. And then also, if the quaternary consumer was present, then it would be passed on to something like a hawk, a polar bear, or a bald eagle. What you see here in this image is an actual network of producers and consumers. You have various species that are interacting with one another and passing energy from one organism to another. And you see that the arrows to show you what is consuming what within that image. And we call that a food web. There are some various relationships that exist between organisms within an ecosystem, and this is when these organisms interact with one another. They're interdependent, and they live in very close proximity of one another, and we call that symbiosis. An example of symbiosis is going to be mutualism, like you see between the honeybee and the flower, where both organisms are benefiting. That's what makes it mutual. Both organisms are benefiting from the relationship. The honeybee gets the sugar from the flower, and the flower is able to experience reproduction through pollination. You see another example here between the antelope and the spider. It's called commensalism, where one organism benefits, but the other is not harmed. It has no effect on that organism. So you can see that the spider is the one that is benefiting from the relationship by creating its web between the horns of the antelope. Another relationship that happens between organisms is parasitism. You can see where in this relationship it's going to be the tick that is getting all the benefit from the relationship, but it's a relationship that can cause harm. So while the tick is benefiting, the dog is actually experiencing some harm to its skin, and you see that the dog begins to scratch. You see here the predator-prey relationship within an ecosystem. The prey is the actual organism that is being consumed or sought after, while the predator is the actual seeker. So you see in this graph is pictured the relationship between predator and prey, which we call the boom and the bust. And in this relationship, whenever the prey population goes down, the predator relationship is going to go down. And whenever the prey relationship goes up, then the predator relationship is going to go up, just like you see between the lynx and the snowshoe hare. The next two graphs that you see pictured are what we call the exponential growth and logistics growth model. And in exponential growth, you're going to see a J curve. That means that the population has grown rapidly and very quickly. It's called doubling over, where in the logistics model, you're going to see the actual exponential growth at the very beginning, but then the population is going to be level off due to what we call carrying capacity. So there's going to be something that's actually happened in that ecosystem that caused that population to die off or level off, and that can be anything like a natural disaster, an increased amount of predators in the area, or it could be related to human impact, which we'll get to in our next video. So that wraps up our second lesson on ecosystems. Hopefully you've got an understanding as it relates to how the energy pyramid works, energy being passed on from one organism to another. You've gotten an understanding of the role of producers and their relationship with consumers, and that you understand that there's some relationships that take place between producers and consumers that we call symbiosis, and that's going to be mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, and predator-prey relationships. And so this wraps up our lesson on ecosystem, lesson number 2.